So we're actually right up to our next panelist, Erica Young. She's joining us from London. Hello, Erica. How are you?
Hi there. I don't know how I'm supposed to go after that, but I'm going to give it my best shot. Hopefully this will be the how in terms of how you diversify your networks and drive some of these outcomes that we're looking for.
Exactly. And these are all pieces to the same puzzle, you know, and every one of them is so important. And hearing from different voices and how we can come together and work together, it's so incredibly important. So yes, it's incredibly timely to be going into yours. So so you are currently a principal at Anthemis Group in London, in the UK, and you've been working with Anthemis to drive their portfolio success by applying network science principles, and I'm sure you're going to dive a little bit into your background, so I'm excited to hear that. And today you're going to be discussing cultures, companies, and networks. So yeah, let's get started.
All right. So can we see screen now?
Yes.
Awesome.
Screen is visible.
Fantastic. All right. So I know we've talked quite a bit about all the different aspects of design, and I think we've really been talking a lot about design with a very big D, right? And so I guess I want to push the boundaries of that even further and talk about how we might start influencing design of cultures, companies, and networks. And I think one of the great things about the talks that we've had so far is that in almost every one, networks have come up, right? How we think about community, how do we think about the people that support us, how do we think about the diversity of the people around us? And so I think that this is so critical and important right now to be thinking very proactively about it. And the challenge we face is that us as designers, we're human, which means we also fall victim to what's called domain dependence. And this is basically when you don't apply skills from one domain into another context. So we do a great job of following good design practice, you know, when we're creating apps or we're creating products, but we don't often, or we suddenly forget really to apply those skills to design better meetings or better interactions with other people. And so I'm hoping that this talk will inspire you a little bit to move outside of those core domains and start applying your practice design skills more liberally. I think that the main thing that I guess I'm hoping that you'll believe at the end of this is that doing so will really help to shape your environment, and that these skills can actually be applied immediately, regardless of your level of seniority in your current organization. Though I do agree that owning your work is incredibly powerful. While I have no doubt that great product design in the smaller D sense can disrupt, I think, as you can see, looking at cultures, networks, companies, things that are a bit more complex, can start to push the boundaries and have even greater impact. So let's put this into context a little bit. So if we think about the different types of design that we can practice, they tend to increase in complexity as we gain experience and start to push the boundaries of our craft. In the beginning, you might start off designing individual products, such as, I don't know, a frying pan or an app. And at some point, you might transition to creating a whole line, you know, of products and creating a cohesive design language across that product line. Maybe that's cookware or several apps that are for different use cases. And soon, you start applying to yourself, how the product team works together, how you prioritize features, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Before long, you start designing the whole organization, right? So you're thinking about how your sales team is incentivized to ensure that you get constant supply of customer feedback. You think about your customer service processes and how they reflect the company's brand or experience. And this is where you start to move out of the realm of the complicated and into the realm of the complex. So what do I mean by that? This little clever framework by Dave Snowden does a really good job of explaining the difference. Things that are obvious have best practice. A great example of that is text in books, right? It's almost always serif. Things that are complicated have good practice, but there are many ways to achieve, you know, a successful outcome. So for example, there are many different mobile phones on the market. They're all manufactured in slightly different ways. There are many similarities in terms of form factor, features, materials, but there's no single best practice here. Things that are complex are emergent. And that's really like understanding creativity itself. We have some idea about how creativity happens. We have some habits, hacks to help inspire creativity, but we can't really measure creativity and we don't completely understand how it works. Today, I really want to focus on the intersection between the complicated and the complex. So a little bit more about me. My name is Erica Young, and I work for, as you guys mentioned, a venture capital firm called Anthemis. Our mission is to cultivate change in financial services. We design and invest in companies that solve problems in the space of banking and insurance. We've invested in over 100 companies. A couple of the investments you might be familiar with are Betterment and Trove. Over the course of my career, I've designed individual products as diverse as military boots and soccer cleats and even robots. And I've also developed product lines and built design teams. I've co-founded companies, and I've even designed a few with a great team here at Anthemis. Now I'm applying my skills to design networks to support the growth of our companies and the ones that Anthemis has invested in. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but we'll build up to that over time. So I think we should first talk about what does it mean when you start designing culture in an organization, right? So you can really think about this in two halves. There's the external facing part, which is the experience, the brand identity, the engagement with the customers, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's also the internal stuff. So that's really talking about the culture. How do people, what's the experience of working in that organization? They show up in how you celebrate somebody's birthday or what happens when something goes wrong. So I think that these are the types of moments where the culture of an organization really comes out. So it might seem a little bit strange to say that a culture can be designed, but we watch founders do it absolutely every day. In fact, we factor their ability to design a successful culture into our investment decisions. We help them to maintain that culture over time as they grow. And the reason for that is healthy and unhealthy cultures in teams of 5 people are amplified when the team grows to 50, 150, and beyond. So there's been this massive shift, and I think that we should think about how that change has occurred from the industrial age to the information age. And this has really had a huge impact on the way in which we work. Teams need to be able to sense and respond to their environment more rapidly, which means they can't wait for top-down directives. They need to be able to attract and keep and nurture the most talented people, which means that they need to find meaning in their work, as we've talked a lot about over the course of today. They need to be able to have the opportunity to improve their skills, and they need to be incentivized appropriately, which doesn't always mean money. And they also need the ability to experiment, right? And try things and potentially fail without repercussions. So in acknowledgement of this, this transition that's occurring, there's this wonderful design firm called The Ready, who focuses on organizational design that's created this organization operating system. And this is kind of a canvas to help people design and redesign the way their organizations work. So this framework helps people identify kind of the systems and processes that are working well in the organization, some of the ones that are missing completely, and some that are really not serving the organization at this point in time. So, for example, authority focuses on how organizations make decisions. So think of your own organization. How many of you guys know with clarity what decisions you can make independently and which ones require consultation or even approval? What does that balance say about how power is shared in the organization? Another one that you could look at is strategy. So strategy focuses on planning and prioritization. A simple comparison might be a more traditional waterfall approach versus agile software development. One of them requires months and months of advanced planning, and the other is organized in sprints. Another example is how organizations engage with data, which is increasingly important these days. If you think about how data is valued in your organization and how it's used to create feedback loops and help teams learn. For example, how successful is your organization at using data to inform new features or products? So I think that these thoughts, or if you reflect on kind of these pains and experiences of your organization, all of these things have been designed, and we can apply the same processes we use to design products or services to the organization itself using this type of framework. We've actually used this at Anthemis to ensure we maintain a strong culture as we grow, and we also use it with companies to help them manage growing pains as they grow their organization. So we can talk more about that as we get into the Q&A. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about companies. So the idea of designing companies is relatively new. The first startup studio, as they're often referred to. Sometimes you hear startup studios, sometimes you hear venture studios, sometimes venture builder perhaps, was IdeaLab, and that was started back in 1996. Over the last 5 years, this space has just blown up. There are now, dozens, if not hundreds of organizations that do this day in and day out. So, it begs the question, why might someone design a business? And I think that it really depends on what you're trying to achieve. If you are, let's say you're a corporation, so it's really about how do I leverage the strategic value that I have? How do I leverage IP that I have? How do I protect myself or hedge myself against future risk of the organization? And so in these situations, an organization might choose to design a business to help fill some of those gaps or leverage some of the assets that they have. We actually have strategic partnerships with both Barclays and BBVA that help them do just that. So if you're an investor, which is what Anthemis is, designing companies gives you access to opportunities before anyone else has them. It also lets you use market intelligence to design companies they believe shouldn't exist or should exist, but don't yet. So for people who are not familiar with this journey, I'll break it down in a little bit more detail. So like us, most of us can only invest in companies when they're publicly traded. We do this by buying stock, right? Private equity firms and venture capital firms are able to invest in companies that are privately owned. And what that means is they can invest sometimes when a company is only a couple years old. Accelerators and incubators like Y Combinator or Techstars often work with and invest in companies even before they receive any venture capital or private equity investment. So if you think about it, we're moving a little bit to earlier stages in the journey. Angel investors, which are individual investors who might have exited a previous company, or they might be part of a family office or independently wealthy, often get involved even earlier in the process. But they actually still need the company to be incorporated in order to invest in it. So that's a really key difference. There is actually a growing set of investors that are getting involved even before a company is incorporated, which means there isn't any entity to invest in. This is where designing companies happens. And this is the bit that I want to focus on. So just like the Venn diagrams from before, when you move from applying design to the culture of a company to designing the company itself, there are a few additional things that you kind of need to add to the mix. You can think of them like product features of a service design or something like that. They're trade-offs, they're considerations, they're materials, they're resources that you're leveraging. So one of those is the business model. Then this is how the company's likely to make money. You have a hunch about this or a hypothesis. You actually haven't tested it out yet. But the company is going to need money to grow as an organization and generate revenue, and also to attract additional investment. Since frameworks such as the business model canvas are pretty well established, I won't focus on any time of this today, but I remember the first time that I looked at a business model book. It reminded me a lot of an old material and processes book from my industrial design days. So it's basically like a menu of options that you could flip through and use, and that might apply, given your current constraints or your situation. So the other thing that's really important is the founding team. This is the team that's going to build the company. Since misalignment is one of the most common reasons that a company fails, it's really important to get this right. It also strongly influences the culture that we just talked about, because the habits, norms, and rituals that these people have are the seeds of the culture of that organization. And the last bit that's also important is the investment and the governance. So this is really what types of investment that the company is going to take. What type of company is it going to be? Is it going to be a corporation, a public benefit corp, a charity? So all of these different things impact the governance of the organization. So we also often think about these together. Since Anthemis is a venture capital firm, we focus on designing companies that would benefit from the type of investment that we offer, which is venture capital investment. Other people designing companies might optimize for different characteristics. So if you are a corporate venture builder or a different type of startup studio, you might be looking to generate revenue very quickly, or you might be looking to leverage government grants or the number of even Kickstarter campaigns, right, and have people prepay. So all of these things are considerations that you can have in the design process for a company. So one of the other things that's important to think about is this: when we're sort of hanging out in this realm of the complicated to the complex, it turns out that designing companies, because it sits in that space, sits on this kind of interesting continuum from what we call founder-led to concept-led. Concept-led means that you start with the idea for a business, and then you try to marry that business to a founder or a founding team. In some cases, it might be okay to hire someone to run the new company, but because we're a venture capital firm, we want people who are willing to take ownership over the company and don't just act like employees. So the other end of the spectrum is founder-led. So that means that you start with the founder and you actually co-design the business with them, usually focusing on the problem that they're most interested in solving, particularly if it's strategically aligned with your interests. Often what actually happens is kind of somewhere in the middle. And this is where initial concept attracts a founder who subsequently identifies, based on their experience and skills, how they want to modify that product. And it's this back and forth between the founder and the concept that really results in the business that we end up founding. So let's talk a little bit more in depth about what the founding team looks like. And so because canvases are quite popular, we've also developed a canvas for how to think about a founding team. And you can think about that as what are kind of the ingredients, or what are the design features that I'm looking for in this team, and in order to ensure that it runs smoothly and that it's very cohesive and effective together. So the analogy that I like to draw is that assembling a founding team is like being a music producer for a boy band. You're trying to bring together the right mix of characteristics and complementary skill sets. And to be honest, it's an awful lot like designing a great interdisciplinary team, except that you're going to hand them a company, right, and money to build it together. So at Anthemis, we've done quite a lot of work to think about what makes a good founding team, which I'll walk you through right now. So at the foundational level, which we've been talking about an awful lot today, and the last panel did a great job of illustrating some of the challenges we still have around this, we strongly believe that diversity is absolutely critical to a team's success. We consider all the different types of diversity, including identity, such as race, cognitive, such as education or professional training, and even neurological, such as being on the spectrum. Similarly, there are a handful of characteristics that we look for in every individual member of a founding team. One of these is a growth mindset. We want founders that believe their abilities can be developed through dedication and hard work. Brains and talent are just a starting point. There's also a handful of characteristics that we want at least one founding team member to exhibit. One of those is purpose. At least one team member should have the determination and the resolve to solve the problem that the company is trying to address. Similarly, there are a handful of competencies that we would like to see at least one team member have. These are specific to the company that they found. So if it's an insurtech company, which is short for insurance technology, it might be experience in underwriting. If it's a banking company, it might have something to do with payments. So we are obviously looking for competencies and skill sets that help accelerate this growth, but those are subservient to the other foundational, characteristics that I've just described. So as a team, there's several more things that we like to see, but they actually don't show up individually. Only when they come together as a group, and that's what's so critical about them. So for example, we know how important it is for team members to feel safe in order to be creative and to learn. So together, we want them to exhibit signs of psychological safety. While the canvas focuses on desirable characteristics, there are a handful of things that we watch out for, some of which fall in the bucket of unwanted characteristics and others that are unimportant, but sometimes play with our biases a little bit. So one of the things that we watch out for is someone who's reckless. So there is a big difference between someone who's a calculated risk taker and somebody who's actually a thrill seeker. So we want to watch out for the latter. The one thing we're cautious about is extroversion. So while it has no bearing on someone's success as a founder, we sometimes have a bias towards the charisma that often comes with that extroversion. So these are some of both the recklessness and the extroversion of some of these myths that people have, like age and like gender and other things that people like personify in their ideal founder that are actually just really unhelpful. So we actually, recently, there's been some research that said that the average founder age of a successful startup is actually 45, which is way older than what most people would expect, right? So if we move on from the founding team and we talk a little bit about investment and governance, I'd like to bring up this graphic design Venn diagram. And what's clever about this is it just reminds us that we can have two of the three options on the table, but generally not all three. And I think that investment and governance is actually quite similar to that. So there are a number of choices that a company can make in choosing their investment and how they structure their governance. And it's really about how much control the ownership or ownership of the company that the founding team wants and what they're willing to give up in exchange for the investment. So, for example, the founding team can choose to keep 100% of the ownership of the company and grow organically. And one of the most, I guess, enduring examples of that is MailChimp. So they didn't take any outside investment and they reinvested the money that they made back into the company in order to grow. Alternatively, a founding team can seek investment, like a business like Airbnb. They'll have to give up some ownership in the company and likely add an investor to their board of directors. But the amount of investment is much bigger and the speed is much faster. So again, we talked a little bit about some of the other mechanisms that might exist, but it's helpful to think about these kind of two extremes of the equation and how they're not, there isn't one obvious path. And I think maybe you don't hear a lot of venture capitalists saying this because I think they're obviously seeking people to invest in and want to support their continued growth. But not all businesses are cut out for venture capital, and that's not the right solution for every business that's created. So I know a lot of this stuff sounds quite theoretical, so I'm going to give you a really tangible example from my own experience. So almost exactly 3 years ago, I met a person who is as passionate about financial wellness as I am. And we started working together, designing and testing ideas for companies. Eventually, he landed on the idea for a new type of peer-to-peer bank that would serve people excluded from the current banking infrastructure. We co-designed the business model. We helped choose the country to launch in. We helped find his CTO. We even helped design early stages of the app. So if you think about all the different levels that we've been talking about in terms of where design can be applied, we hit every level of it. Most of this, even before the company was incorporated. So at this point, that business has received additional venture capital funding from a top-tier investor, has grown rapidly, both in terms of employees and also customers. And it's fair to say that this company might not exist if it weren't for our collaboration. The processes and skills that we used to design this company were not that different from what you would use to design a product or service. You're just working with different materials, constraints, and trade-offs. So that business, just has a huge impact, right? So I think this is kind of maybe the one main point that I want to get across is that the impact that you can have when you're operating at that scale is unbelievable. So this company has improved the lives of tens of thousands of people and is worth many millions of dollars today. And that's, 3 years, right? We're only at the beginning. So the last section that I want to talk about is networks. And this is where things get even more abstract. So I appreciate that this is a little bit of a challenge for some. So while we were designing companies, we noticed that networks played a key role in our efforts. They became the how of our work and shaped what companies we designed, what founding teams we assembled, and who became supporters of those companies. So what do I mean when I talk about networks? When people hear the word network, they often think, or their mind jumps to networking. So here I am exclusively using it as a noun, not a verb. And I'm talking about the people, the organizations, the ideas that are all connected through different types of relationships. So they're usually drawn like this, where the people are shown as shapes, called nodes, and the relationships between them are shown as lines, called edges. The whole visual is described as a graph. So you can draw all of your friends based on who knows who, and you could draw a graph of all the products in your company based on which products have been sold together. So the type of information that you display can vary greatly. And in this world of networks, we don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to focus on two aspects of it, density and diversity. So these are really foundational and particularly relevant to both startup founders and designers alike. Sorry, guys. There we go. So density is basically the measure of how interconnected a network is. So as you can see here, we'll call her Alice, is part of a very connected network where most of the people know each other. We would say that this network was high density. B, on the other hand, we'll call him Bob, has the same number of people in his network, but most of them don't know each other. We would describe this as low density. So why does it matter? Imagine Alice and Bob are the founders of two different companies. Alice has a strong support network surrounding her, which helps her deal with the emotional challenges of starting a company. However, she might be exposed to a lot of groupthink because her network knows each other and they're likely to think very similarly. Bob, on the other hand, doesn't necessarily have a supportive environment like Alice has, but he has access to diverse perspectives that are not influenced by each other. They're critical to giving him access to new ideas. The same is true for us as creatives. We need to balance the positive reinforcement and support that a close network offers with the ability to access new ideas and different points of view. We actually did ethnographic research to understand the support networks of our founders, and we found that these different networks did appear and did have the impact that I'm describing. And we actually used that as a coaching mechanism to help the founders to diversify their network, which was really interesting. So the second aspect of it that I'd like to spend some time on is diversity, right? Which is, there we go. So we got Alice and Bob back here again. And we know for sure that diverse teams and perspectives drive successful outcomes. That's well documented. So I'm not going to dispute that. And it doesn't really matter. I mean, we might be able to achieve that in a less dense network, but it won't help you if everybody's similar to you. So one of the most enduring aspects of networks is what sociologists call homophily. That means that people tend to hang out with people that are just like them. So Bob here, he's got a bunch of people around him. They're all like him, makes it super easy to work, but doesn't necessarily give him the diversity that he needs in order to be truly successful. In contrast, Alice has managed to surround herself with incredibly diverse people. And we're not looking at color here, we're looking at shapes, but all the forms of diversity that are critical to our success. The challenge with that is it does, if these people don't speak the same native language, it will take longer and it will be harder to get work done. But the outcome is going to be far superior than Bob's network. So we have to be really vigilant about incorporating diversity into our networks. At Anthemis, 50% of our employees are women, 20% of our portfolio company founders are women, and we have money dedicated to female founders. As you might imagine, this is pretty unprecedented in financial services and venture capital, and we are putting basically the same amount of effort towards underrepresented communities. We also, in response to COVID, have designed a pilot service that incorporates both of these principles. We allow all of our founders to opt in to a recurring matching service where we connect them to a peer in the portfolio who's interested in talking through a similar challenge. And that additional connection provides both resiliency to our network and diversity for the individual companies within it. So in the little bit of time that I've left, I'm going to talk a little bit about how ideas evolve. And so this is recent research from Mark Ventresca at Oxford University, who show that actually the ideas and the founders co-evolve together over time. So let's say Alice has an idea. She shares it with her friend, who recommends that she goes to an event on a related topic. At that event, she meets someone who's interested in the idea and wants to become an advisor and provide input into that idea. The advisor introduces her to a former colleague who offers to be an investor in that business, but he has certain requirements about making that investment. That investor maybe has several peers, and they often co-invest together. And they share ideas and feedback and really start to shape her idea. You can see how Alice making her way through this network shapes the business that she's creating and the network at the same time. So you can also see how high density and low density might negatively impact her idea here. She could end up with lots of similar opinions or things that don't really expand her thinking. And last but not least, I'm going to spend the tiniest bit of time, because I think this is really valuable to designers, on the concept of the adjacent possible. So this was originally developed by a complexity scientist called Stuart Kauffman. And the application was biology, but I think it's widely applicable. And they have actually found ways to mathematically model innovation. And it shows how the impossible follows from what already exists. So they're able to account for these existing things and then show, let's say, a new software tool or even an entirely new product to the world are basically mathematically the same, and how these become emergent or exposed to people is quite consistent. So I'll give you another specific example. So remember when I said that assembling founding teams is like being a music producer for boy bands? In the fall of 2014, I told someone that's what I wanted to do. And they said, what are you going to do since that job doesn't exist? Later that year, I met the CEO of Anthemis, who introduced me to the idea of designing companies. Suddenly, for me, that job became possible. And so I think it also goes back to this point of maybe your job title doesn't matter, but the job title that you may not have or that you may have in the future might not yet exist. So I know this is a lot to digest, and I want to provide a little bit of inspiration in terms of the things that you can do with this information. So first and foremost, it's worth applying design at all these levels. You can think about a gap that you have in your network and how you might fill that gap with somebody that is different than you, right? So somebody, a piece of information or a sector or a analogous field that might be influential and helpful in terms of your design and your inspiration, go fill that gap. If you have an organization that has a culture that is missing some elements that are really important to you, design a habit or process to reinforce that behavior and start to shift the culture in your organization. And last but not least, go to the Slack channel and meet somebody new, set up a video chat, because that serendipity is incredibly important to our networks and to our livelihood. Thanks again.
Hi, Erica. Thank you so much for that talk. Wow. I think everyone is just sitting back with a mind blown in terms of the amazing research and information you just shared with all of us. Lots of food for thought. I know we have, about 10 minutes, and if you're up for it, there are just a couple of questions that I'd love to ask you.
Sure.
I love the space you're in, because you're definitely in this cross section between entrepreneurialism and design. And I love the concept that you're talking about designing companies, cultures, as well as networks, and how all of those things are so critical for our lives. What specific design skills do you use on a regular basis in your current role?
I would say definitely use customer research, all forms of exploratory research, ethnographic research, user testing, right? So anything about trying to understand and test and iterate a process or a system is quite critical. I would say basic UI UX type work. So some of the services that we design for our founders, they need to be able to engage with it like any other customer would. And so those things are quite important. I think the thing that you notice when you get outside of the design profession and you hang out in the world, particularly of finance, is that just the ability to do generative thinking, right? So not deductive reasoning, but to generate something, create something new, think of ideas, is actually not as widely available as you might expect. And so even just that basic skill is hugely valuable.
And it's funny, as designers, we all have that skill set and kind of take for granted that not everyone does. So that's a really great point, that when you're in these multidisciplinary situations in a finance world, in a venture capital world, you have a great skill set that can be such an asset. So what are some of the challenges you come up against when you're designing businesses and running through those exercises?
Yeah, so as I talked about this kind of whole realm of the complex, there are all sorts of externalities, right? And macro environmental, like, COVID is a great example, right? That you just can't account for. We've had, you name it, we've had it in terms of interactions with founders. So a founder's partner gets really sick, or a partner's family member gets into money troubles, and suddenly the ability to found a company is no longer available to them. So I think, like, you're dealing with, these are people's lives and this is their livelihood. And so you have all of the complexity that comes along with that. And in addition to the complexity of just, creating a good business or product or all these other things. But I think it's those challenges that help you realize what's really important and refocus and I guess, remember that there's this kind of important but not urgent quadrant that you need to spend some time in.
Yeah. And are you guys, as Anthemis, are you typically, what's your percentage rate of investment in these companies? I know you mentioned a lot of them you're building from the ground up before they're even a formulated or registered entity. They're kind of there from the inception. Like, are you like over 50% invested typically, or what's the average?
So I would say, we typically get involved. I would say our sweet spot is what's called seed investment in our industry. And that's usually, I would say, it varies a lot, but it could be from 10% to, let's say, 20% of the company in exchange for something hovering around. It depends what currency you want to use. We're in London today, but probably hovering around the low million mark. In terms of the total investment in the business. So there are other venture capital firms that get involved much later, but venture capital is, like, without fail, they are looking for a minority stake in the business, right? They want this business to be incentivized to grow very rapidly. And so they are not going to take a controlling stake in any business.
Oh, got it. Interesting. And I definitely love the concept you went over about how, founders engaging in networks and developing their ideas kind of are running on a parallel track, which I think all of us know from an iterative design process definitely happens. You bounce things off people and your idea kind of changes shape and reformulates. But I think it's fascinating to think about how that is applicable to a business model or an actual company that comes out as a result at the end. Do you have any stories about maybe when, you were developing or designing a business, something went drastically wrong?
Well, I think a lot of these, the jury's still out, right? But we did have, I'll give an example that relates to the adjacent possible. We basically had designed a digital insurance product. And the idea was we were going to help electric vehicle car owners to buy insurance for their electric vehicle. And there were certain characteristics of that market and of the car itself and the pricing that existed in the insurance space and the lack of data that made this a really interesting space for us to operate, right? And the thing that was really interesting is we're going forward, we're getting the founder on board, we start noodling on this idea together with them, and they go out and do some additional customer research. And they come back and they're like, this is great and all, and I agree with the idea and principle, but the problem is that people can't even buy electric vehicles. I went to the dealership, I tried to test drive this car, I tried to I tried to call up the dealership and get information. Here are all the hoops that I had to go through. And so people are never even getting to the point where they can buy the insurance because they can't even test drive the car to decide they want to purchase it. And so, so it really made us kind of step back and think about this idea in a different context. And that's not a crash and burn scenario, right? But it's a situation where the adjacent, not the adjacent possible, but the kind of iterative approach of you engaging and then reevaluating and testing and iterating and how that starts to shape the idea. You have to be very flexible around that because you have no idea what, the language we use in startups is pivoting. And you don't know how many pivots you're going to have to make. And you have to be quite have a low need to seek closure, right? So that you can explore all those possible outcomes.
It's like the number of blue foam models required for a just the unlimited pivots, unlimited foam models.
Exactly.
I really love it. And, you also touched on networks, and I kind of feel like there was this really good challenge you put out there. It's like you kind of think you're networking or you have a good network, but you're talking about like depth and breadth and like how many people you're covering, and are they all thinking the same way? Do they have different points of view? And it's I think so important that as we're all going through our careers, you have to really hyper focus on, how do I curate my network? How do I push myself outside of my comfort zone and talk to people that don't think the way I do and kind of branch out? Obviously at Anthemis, I'm sure all day long you guys are doing this when you're building, very customized teams. What got you interested in networks? I know you're doing a lot in that research right now.
Yeah. So the way it started is I moved to London and I wanted to know, how do I build my network here, right? I'd moved internationally from the US to Hong Kong. I'd been in Hong Kong for a long time. I then moved to London and I was like, let's see how I actually build my network. And what are the myths we tell ourselves about how we make friends and build a network. And I actually started keeping track. So where did I meet somebody? In what context did I meet them? What strength of relationship did we achieve? What were the characteristics that made that work or not work? And I mean, of course, it's N=1, but actually it turns out that a lot of my research is backed by, bigger data sets and additional research done by professionals and academics. So I think that's really what got me, initially into it. And I think, you look at the Harvard longitudinal study, relationships are the single biggest indicator of whether we live a long, healthy life, period. Not genetics, not lifestyle choices, and so when you put it in that context, it's kind of amazing we don't spend more time on it and we don't think about the consequences, right? And it doesn't have to be about the structure as I described, but it could be just about where you put your time and energy.
Yeah, and making sure that you're putting effort in to cultivate it based on kind of where you want to grow, the space you want to grow into, which was a topic you and I kind of touched on before, is, hop into that space, dip a toe into a different network or category. Don't be afraid that you don't know anyone, and you never know what can happen. Well, I think we're coming to the end of the segment, but gosh, can't thank you enough. What an inspiring talk. Love it. My mind is blown. I don't know about everyone else. I think they're also in the same boat, but it's so great to see you in person. And I think Kelly said she's going to throw up the agenda just to kind of remind everyone what's coming up next. And we'll see you at the happy hour, Erica. Thanks so much.